Thank you, Beach, for that very kind introduction. As I've already been introduced, I'm Liam Carr, and I'd like to thank a few more people just before I start, all the staff at Ascentis, but in particular Jessica and Joanne for their organisation. And I'd like to thank all of you here for making the effort to journey here to learn about sustainability. The format of the speech will be some introductions. I'll introduce myself, and then you'll introduce yourselves, again, but slightly differently in the way you just did, to those in your vicinity. Then I'll speak for around 35 minutes. I'll try and hold your attention, and I'll take points and questions. So if you have a question you'd like to share, or you'd like to share some of the aspect of the sustainability journey in your own organisation, please do make a note of it and do that at the end, because I come from a teaching background. There's nothing worse when you finish and it's like, any questions? And no one's got a question. So do make a note of anything that crops up in your mind throughout the time that I'm talking. So I'm Liam Carr, and I'm the Sustainability and Curriculum Coordinator for NCG. We're a group of 7 colleges and working anti-clockwise around the country. That's Carlisle, West Lancashire, Kidderminster, Lewisham, so the Newcastle Sixth Form, and Newcastle College. My role has a few aspects. I train staff in the delivery of sustainability units, which is very important. There's lots of new sustainability units coming on stream now. I try and enable colleagues to embed sustainability in their own practice, and I coordinate awareness-raising events around significant days like Earth Day and COP27. Before I was lucky enough to get this role, I led the Access team within Newcastle College. And prior to Access, I was a science teacher. I've taught in secondary schools. I used to teach biology at A-level, and I've taught the International Baccalaureate in an international school in India. And I've only recently started my sustainability role for the group. For many years, I looked after the higher education provision, the access to higher education provision at Newcastle College. And we used Ascentis for our access to HE provision. And Phil and the team haven't said that I need to stand up here and be an advert for Ascentis as an awarding body, but I will say this, that their qualifications are rigorous. They supply quite high-quality assessment materials and resources. They're well recognised by universities and higher education institutions. And the team, 27 of whom are here today, are really incredibly supportive. They're a real step away from some awarding bodies where teaching staff have to write the assessments, mark them, and then moderate them. Because Ascentis do much more than scrutinise or just rubber stamp what colleges do, and working with them was a pleasure, and it really did feel like a partnership. So that's that bit out of the way. My time in access to higher education was the most rewarding job I've had in my career in education. Because as previous speakers have indicated, access to HE students come into colleges from a variety of different backgrounds. They've got different starting points. And while there's no typical access students, they haven't gone through that route that I did, where you do your GCSEs, you do your A-levels, and you go off to university. And it was interesting, just before, I was speaking to a colleague from the South Coast who described that journey into getting into education later. And she's now making a great contribution to teaching ESOL, and that's all been done after that normal point. And so that's my introduction out of the way. So I always say that introductions are important, so I'd like you to start by introducing yourselves to the people around you in a slightly different way than you just did for Beach. So if you start with the usual, your name and your preferred pronouns, you don't have to worry about where you're from. But after that, could you share how you travelled here today, please? Just a couple of minutes on that. So you have actually got a couple of minutes left. I'd just like to extend your discussion. Make sure that everyone in the group's had a chance to speak, because that's important, that anyone who's been sitting quietly can share their mode of transport. But just one more thing for a minute. And between yourselves, did anyone consider the impact on the environment of their chosen mode of travel today? Just a couple of minutes on that one, please. Thanks. When I looked after access to HE, I was like you too. The best part of coming to these conferences is the conversations, and there will be time to restart those a bit later. But thanks for your attention coming back to myself just then. So any answer to that would have been okay. But if you said that you did consider the environmental impact of travel, or that's something you consider in your everyday life, then do consider sharing that at the end when we come to our questions. And if you didn't, then that's also fine. Because in any organization or group of people, you'll find those for whom sustainability is an issue that will affect how we choose to live our lives. And for most of us, we know it's something we should be doing more on. And for some people, maybe colleagues or friends, recognize other things as more important. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a sustainability journey, and it's the one that we're still on, because we still haven't reached our destination. The Access to HE team at Newcastle College recognized the needs to enable students to move on to next steps in the sustainable environmental science sector. So we started a new environmental science diploma back in 2013. And if you were thinking about this, just go ahead and do it. Because since then, students have gone on to study environmental science, sustainable management, ecology, zoology, agriculture, and plant science. And these students are going to contribute to what we know about sustainability, how we grow more of our own food in a changing climate, and how best we can mitigate against the effects of climate change. And the work that those students have gone on to do is much needed, because we are in a climate crisis. And while it's a crisis of our own making, the solutions will also be of our own making. I'm a biologist, and my love of biology came from my love of being outside as a child. Growing up, as I did, in a small, fairly insular mining village in the northeast of England, I spent a lot of time playing out down the woods with my twin brother. And the wild places between old pit villages is a diverse range of habitats. And recently I campaigned against a new surface mine on the habitat of a rare amphibian, the great crested newt. And to cut a long story short, that long story is told in a film that's doing the film festival circuit at the minute called Finite, the Climate of Change. But to cut that very long story short, we lost the campaign, and over 500,000 tons of coal was excavated from the northeast coal field from an area where mining hadn't happened since the miners' strike. So new coal was extracted in 2020, and that's being burned right now in power stations. The concept of a new coal mine still baffles me. And I'm from the northeast, and we have a proud mining history, but coal is our heritage, not our future. I can't help make links between the skills shortage and perhaps something a little more worrying than a skills shortage, but an ideas shortage. Not solely a lack of ideas, but that coupled with the lack of finance to implement innovative solutions leads us to looking backwards rather than forwards, and results in a sort of over-reliance on old pollutant technologies. Back to playing out as a child when I didn't have to worry about new coal mining or how people across the world will cope with the effects of a changing climate. My formative years were spent outside in those rugged landscapes, and I used to think of the outdoors as magical as a child. And it is magic, really, that something alive can be found almost anywhere out of doors. And that was likely in a large part of why I chose to study science. That simple love of nature is also found in a lot of the rest of the scientific community. And we, as scientists, have framed the climate conversation around our own interests. So we study habitats. So we speak of how desertification has led to habitat loss and species extinction in terrestrial habitats. We speak how deforestation leads to the loss of not only some of the most biodiverse habitats, but also limits the ability of our planet to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So can I teach a bit of science? I'm going to try. It'll take a few minutes of your time. In Central America, there was this golden toad, all right, Buffo perennialis. And the picture of it was taken, this picture was taken in 1978. And that toad is now extinct. We can't study it or learn from it now. And its extinction was caused by climate change. And in science, causation is difficult to prove. Correlation between species extinction and climate change is well known about, but causation has a higher burden of proof. So there's a couple of things that went wrong here for the golden toad, and that's the cloud forests in Costa Rica. The climate there changed, and that led to the very specific conditions that toad lived in not existing anymore in the very high mountains of Costa Rica. So the habitat changed, and because the conditions have changed, the need of the toad had changed, and therefore that habitat was lost. So climate had caused habitat loss. Also, unfortunately for the toad, it was susceptible to the chytrid fungus, which is common in a lot of amphibians. And you might think, you would argue, fungus that caused the extinction, not climate change, until you look at the detail and you study amphibians further, and you realize that amphibian immune systems, they are compromised by fluctuations in temperature, so large changes of heating and cooling, not climatic changes, like weather changes for the individual amphibian will compromise their immune system, and that's what climate change causes, and that has also contributed to the extinction of this toad. So we know there's not very many species for this where extinction causes climate change, but it's definitely a correlation. And the extinction rate is greater than the discovery rate of new species. So we're making things extinct that we've never even met yet, and we can't learn from them at all. So that's my bit of science out of the way. I enjoyed it. Some of you might be really inspired by the toad, and it might go along to change how you think and what you do in your organizations. But it's actually unlikely to do that. Scientists study rare and threatened species, and I've just done what climate scientists have done for years, and I've framed an argument based around a very narrow example. Polar bears, for example, the sort of poster animal of the climate crisis, may face a similar fate to the golden toad in 1978. We know that melting ice in polar regions is causing habitat loss and reduced polar bear populations, but we've known about this for years. And I'll ask another question. Does knowledge of any issue result in action? Well, sometimes yes, but mainly no. Because if knowledge is going to change behavior, it needs to be. When I was a child, I was told to eat my dinner because there were starving children in Africa. Was anyone in the audience told that? Well, our parents were very woke before woke was a thing. Teaching us about global inequality over the dinner table. What were they thinking? Well, their facts were correct. There was a famine. Hundreds of thousands of children died. But I knew even then that Africa was far away and that the famine would not be solved by me eating vegetables that I didn't much like. Sustainability in our climate are about much more than polar bears, and scientists limiting the argument to individual species makes climate and sustainability such a narrow topic about such faraway places that won't motivate many people to change. Just as starving children in Africa won't motivate unruly 6-year-olds to eat more vegetables, even though today, eating and growing more vegetables is a small sustainable step that we can all take to reduce the amount of carbon that we produce. And if you don't know how to do that, you can start by planting your agendas, and they'll turn into flowers. And maybe if you could move on to planting some veg that you can use in your kitchen. It's a very awareness about famine in the 1980s did result in action in the form of international aids, both from the governments of the world and the charity of individuals, culminating in the 1985 Live Aid concert. But more importantly than that, not outside interventions, but in the countries themselves, by people and their representatives. New agriculture methods were developed and introduced to limit crop loss in drought, and that drought was considered pretty extreme back in the 80s, but there is famine again. Communities are going hungry because crops fail, and what we need is a similar global response. People are being killed now by flooding. In Pakistan, 1,985 lives were lost this year, and it's difficult to talk about, but we can't shy away from difficult climate conversations. At COP27, a water aid representative highlighted an example that women in particular are still suffering the after effects of flooding as access to hygiene has become difficult. This is resulting in uterine infections, with women of childbearing age being told they need a hysterectomy to stop repeated infection spreading to other organs. And there's no easy or comfortable way to discuss this, but climate change causes death due to malaria, diarrheal disease, and directly deaths due to heat stress. The effects of climate change also cause death, so there's an increase in what we would always call natural disasters, the frequency of which isn't natural at all. Climate also has a negative effect on the wider implications of health, such as access to nutritious food and secure shelter. And here in the UK, we are seeing climate-related hospital admissions, and the NHS is used to excess winter deaths, but as weathers get more extreme, we will see acute dehydration and heat stroke in summer too. The cost of living is very current and linked to sustainability, because after initial investment, sustainable energy solutions are local and cheap. In contrast, reliance on old sources of energy from unstable parts of the world has left ordinary people here in the UK vulnerable to global market changes. And colleges are playing a role in this, which we would have never expected before. Newcastle College is providing a warm room for members of the community to use this winter. And it's the right thing to do. Our heating is on anyway. Many near neighbours living in the west of Newcastle may have turned theirs off because they simply can't afford any more energy for that month. I'm not going to spend too much longer on doom and gloom, but decisions in global politics have led us down this path. In October this year, just before Halloween, we saw the nightmare scenario unfold that the consensus had shifted among global climate scientists that limiting global warming at 1.5 degrees wasn't possible, and that binding target set as part of Paris in 2015 would be missed. This has wide-ranging consequences because 1.5 was thought at that point where the consequences go from destructive to absolutely catastrophic. Just yesterday, I had to edit this because there are some agencies contradicting that and saying that 1.5 is still reached, and if we accept that 1.5 is gone, it only benefits people who pollute. So there's a lot of politics around this 1.5. But if we do miss it, the stats aren't great because it leaves 1.7 billion more people are going to experience severe heat waves at least once every 5 years. Millions more people become exposed to climate risks and poverty, and it displaces people as the lands they were born in become less habitable. And some of these, understandably, will seek refuge in other countries. So it is a massive issue in geopolitics, and that inclusion of 1.5 was hard won in the first place. It was brought to the table by vulnerable, small island, less developed countries who pay the greatest price for climate change, both in terms of damage to their economy and loss of human life. They were supported by the EU and countries with ambitious domestic targets. And the US argued overnight over semantics, saying, what's the difference between shall limit emissions and should limit emissions? You get into semantics about the phase down and the phase out of pollutant fossil fuels. The US has since sort of danced to climate okey-cokey, having been out and then into the Paris Agreement under Trump and Biden respectively. And we look across the Atlantic, and we can look at what China's doing, we can look at Brazil and what they're doing and think that everyone could do more. But we haven't been a shining example of stable global leadership on climate either. This year's COP27 seems to me less hopeful than previous years, with allegations of greenwashing, and the conversation dominated by the immense costs of dealing with the effects of climate change and who pays for it. It's always been known that the costs of dealing with the global temperature rise is greater than the economic loss of ending the most pollutant industries. And COP27 was just that fact playing out on a global stage. Greenwashing also raises an interesting question. Should colleges and education providers worry about it? Is moving to become more sustainable and telling others about it, as I'm doing today, does that count as greenwashing? Well, no. It's not greenwashing at all because our business is learning rather than polluting. It would be far worse if an organization was reticent about being involved in the climate conversation because they don't want to be accused of greenwashing. Now, I'm going to ask another question. Just record the answer yourself using your brain. How important is sustainability to you? on this scale of 1 to 6. You can either jot a number down or just keep it in your head. Thank you. I'll ask another question. Remember your number. Rank the environment among these priorities. Now, there'll be a difference in your answers. And that difference is important because we do this in our work life too. We prioritize recruitment over making sure sustainable behaviors are introduced at induction. And everyone is just so busy, particularly teaching colleagues, that we have to, if we've got responsible for sustainability in our own organizations, and college leaders need to make it easy and quick for teaching colleagues, because sustainability is just too vital to be perceived by colleagues as yet another initiative. Because we know, and we'll all know if we've worked in education for any length of time, that new initiatives can get lost in the noise of day-to-day tasks. Gareth Southgate has been England manager for the past 6 years. He's been in charge of England for longer than any of our 4 previous prime ministers. And if he keeps his job, which I think he will, until the next World Cup game against Senegal on Sunday, then he will be in post for longer than David Cameron was in office. Right? And you'd have to go back to Tony Blair to look for anybody who's served longer as a prime minister than our England football manager. And football manager isn't the most sort of long-term of jobs that you can get. So we can see that there's an inherent instability in all democratic systems. And if we look at democratic elections globally, they happen between 2 and 5 years. So there's a short-termism in all political leadership. And that's one reason why we see what we do see in terms of politics on climate, is we see leaders talking more than acting about climate change. And that won't change unless it becomes a real electoral issue. Each leadership change results in a new set of priorities, with all matters seen as more pressing than our environment. Now, our organisations, schools, colleges and councils, councils, that's a funny one, I put that in. Councils do democratically elect their leaders, but not the civil service staff that work within councils. But schools and colleges, definitely, we don't democratically elect our leaders. So there must be a few senior managers in today, and I'm looking out in the audience and asking myself, how many of you would be in post if you had to win a vote? Well, it depends on the electorate. I guess if it was your colleagues, what about if it was your students? I'm sure you'd win either way. But fortunately for at least a few of you, college leaders are not elected. So they can make longer-term decisions, and we can choose to respond in a variety of ways. So investment can be made that takes longer for a return. That decision to replace light sources with LEDs, for example, and I'm sure some colleagues may wish they'd done more like that before the energy price rises we are seeing. The impacts of our energy crisis on education providers are not insignificant, and I'm not going to get into numbers for NCG, but staff wages, for example, quite rightly, are the biggest expense in educational establishments. And the increase in energy costs, if applied to energy bills across college, would be similar in cost to a pay award for every single staff member. How we as individuals, organisations and governments react is interesting and important, and it's a range of individual responses which I'm going to take some time summarising today. Those are denial, helplessness, concern and action. Outright climate denial is still popular. There are many people in the world who don't believe in climate change. According to the UN vote on climate change, which was only taken recently, 1/10 of the population of the US doesn't believe climate change is real. You might think it's a pretty fringe idea accompanied with a mistrust of autonomy, but that's 33 million people. Outright denial isn't common in educational establishments, and there's a clear link between level of education globally and a belief that climate change is an urgent issue. The UK, we lead the way on this, with 81% of people surveyed in 2018 stating their belief in the climate emergency. But climate change denial is something we might find in students, and if we come across it, we shouldn't belittle it. But ask why. Ask where the person got their information from. I find it fascinating. I was passing the time of day with an older neighbour just in the street, and I said, I've got a new job looking after sustainability for a group of colleges. And he asked this question without hesitation. I'm going to quote him directly. He said, do you believe in all of that? And I said, I did. And when I asked further, he said, well, it, meaning sustainability, might be a waste of time, and all of us, meaning scientists, might not be right, and that the climate has always changed. And then finally, just for good measure, he added, well, it probably won't affect me anyway. I was on my way into work at this point, and I get on quite well with this neighbour, so I didn't really have the time or the inclination to get into a doorstep debate, so I just left it. But next time he asks how's work, I'm not going to fall out with him, but I'll make sure I have a climate conversation. And we must be careful as educators not to exist in an echo chamber, believing that all colleagues and students are on the same page as we are about climate and sustainability. The next response is helplessness. And this is common, and it's easy to understand why people might feel helpless and think, well, nothing can be done. It's too late now. And even though they're aware that extremes of weather are causing loss of life, somehow it seems distant, as I was talking about earlier. There's a slightly darker side as well for some individuals who take the climate crisis into their hearts. Climate anxiety is a growing issue, particularly among young people, and can be a contributing factor in their well-being. This could be due to a feeling of powerlessness, and it's something that educators will increasingly come into contact with our students. One thing we can do to help with that is not just tell students what they can do, but our key message as educators is to let them know, while their actions may feel small and insignificant to them, that collectively we do make a difference. Concern is a really common reaction. We are concerned about a lot of things: energy, the environment, and what an uncertain future holds. Some students might be in this state of concern, and we can share their concern, but their courses might let them down. Tutors and lecturers don't mention climate. The concerned student might be silent about this, not wanting to criticize their tutor, but blaming instead the system. Or, if they were being more accurate, they would blame curriculum design for not embedding sustainability sufficiently into their area. None of us want our students to leave us concerned that they don't feel equipped to move into areas that are rapidly changing. This is part of the reason that my post was created this academic year. And then, what if we are called to action? Well, some people take sustainability very much to heart. And these are the change makers. Being sustainable defines us. We become activists or campaigners, or we study the issues in detail and move into jobs with funny titles like Sustainability and Curriculum Coordinator, where we think we might be able to make a difference. We reduce, we reuse, we recycle, and we repair. And awareness is resulted in action, which is exactly what we hope for when we raise awareness. The journey to sustainability is one that we're still on for NCG, but it started before it was ever a priority for the leadership team. And in any organization, it starts with individuals. Individual staff members who've got a personal interest in the environment that would take a lead on this. So in some departments, on Staff Wellbeing Day, colleagues would take action to improve the local environment. You could call it team building, but while doing something useful. Things like litter picking, or one more memorable day was spelt balsam bashing, removing the highly invasive Himalayan balsam from the banks of the Tyne. NCG is a large enough organisation, which meant we had to report our carbon emissions and was involved in the trading of carbon credits. We needed a specialist to sort that out, and Matt, who's a former colleague of the Northern Rock Bank, joined us specifically to work on that. And as a group of colleges, there's no hiding that we produce a lot of carbon. The IT, heating, but not just heat, importantly, cooling to our estate now, makes up the vast majority of our emissions and costs, so it makes sense for that to sit within estates. The cooling bit is quite interesting. Many college buildings are very modern and were built or refurbished recently. They're temperature controlled and they look great, and even though they've got an exterior almost exclusively of glass, many don't have windows that open for ventilation, and it may be difficult to think about this now, but I set off from Newcastle at about 5 a.m. this morning. It was 2 degrees above freezing. Down here, it's about 5 degrees warmer than that. But if you remember the days we had in late summer, we got buildings that were really quite hot. And even with modern integrated air conditioning systems working at full blast, it was uncomfortable for staff and students to work. And that's with us returning in just after the start of September, when we expect temperatures will have dropped. It costs both money and carbon to run air conditioning units. Another decision on the estate side is how we manage our estate to increase biodiversity, which sounds very complicated, but actually can be summarized in about 3 words: stop cutting grass. And the title of this is Go Further. If you want to go further than that, here's 3 more words: plant some trees. NCG have devised a sustainability strategy, which is a little more complex than that. And it's got 8 aspects to it, all with measurable targets and timescales between 2022 and 2040. Aspects would include energy, travel, we make our a bit more eco-friendly, for want of a better word, water, how we source our food, how we get rid of our waste, and then curriculum, which is my main focus, and then finally, biodiversity. And we're looking at student-led projects on these and training students in monitoring things like a hopeful increase in biodiversity. Having a strategy, however, is not an end game. It's the starting point, because we're at different points at each of the different aspects. We use a broker that supplies sustainable energy across the group. We're involved in a project to share heat between buildings from outside of our estate that belong to councils, so we'll be part of a heat sharing network. We have a waste management supply that accurately reports on how we're doing with waste. And in other areas, we've still got a way to go. I'm proud to lead on the curriculum aspect of that strategy, because it's important to take our students on a sustainability journey with us, but also to learn their thoughts. Because whatever our students are going to go and do when they leave us, they're going to be part of a future which needs to be different from our past. The importance of the further education sector in addressing the climate crisis cannot be overstated. All aspects of the provision play a role. Many ESOL lecturers, for example, will already discuss different attitudes towards sustainability in different parts of the world. We're lucky to have Charlotte here from the Education and Training Foundation, who's going to facilitate a session about ESOL, because it's vital to equip all students with the language they're going to need in order to be part of the climate conversation. Employability teams in further education are widening their offer. We hear a lot about the skills gap, with ministers last month telling job seekers to get a green job and attend green skills boot camps. I agree with the policy, and courses are funded, so many colleges are offering them as a first step into shortage technical areas. I'm not sure about calling them boot camps when actually these are introductions to highly skilled roles that are vital for a viable economy in a changing world. The wider education sector can learn a bit from how apprenticeships are categorized. The Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education framework can be used to assess how apprenticeships can contribute to meeting climate change goals, regardless of what sector they happen to be in. And we can extend that thinking into any job or course in any education provider. And this is quite useful because it starts from this assumption that all jobs are green jobs and there are only shades of green. So dark green jobs and courses, they only exist because of our need to change. Easy and spring to mind quickly. Wind turbine engineer, environmental science, food production researcher. Mid-green, these are interesting. Work with colleagues in these areas is absolutely vital because roles and courses in this mid-green area is where the pace of change is high. And change can make people uncomfortable. So we're going to move to construction methods which utilize materials that are more sustainable. We're going to have to build with alternatives to concrete, plaster, and tarmac. Insulation is also changing. Electricians are going to need new methods. Roofers are going to need skills on photovoltaic installation and solar water heating. All of this relates directly to government policy because initiatives can fail due to lack of skills. Funding's being announced for retrofitting different sustainable technology into homes, but there's not enough skilled people to roll schemes out. And this matters because new tech and the funding for it will help our world, but also help individuals cope with rising costs. There's light green. This is where small changes have big impacts. Musicians have declared there's no music on a dead planet, so the impacts of creative industries are very much in the spotlight. In IT, we've got the throwaway nature of devices and the carbon associated with data storage. In health, we've discussed briefly the links between climate and health, but there's more to discuss around the spread of communicable diseases. In hair and beauty, we can learn from the backlash against animal testing and the rise of the body shop that we saw in the 1990s. We are seeing a similar reaction today towards plastic in the ocean. In business and finance, there are green initiatives, green finance initiatives, which are going to form a key part for anybody who's moving into business and finance in the future. Our sector is also leading on T-levels, which will be a step towards parity of esteem between academic and technical qualifications, something which we've struggled with here in the UK. We need our best and brightest to see vocational education as an option, and the fact that it's integral to solving the climate crisis, that may motivate some young people. Also, the degrees which are being offered in colleges are specialist, technical, and distinct from the courses which undergraduates who choose to go to universities are studying. And if we are serious about educating for a sustainable future, these points about T-levels and degrees which are delivered in colleges are absolutely key. There can be no academic versus vocational, no old institutions versus newer ones, because the UK and our world needs people doing academic research right now in all higher education institutions who are going to add to the sum total knowledge on this subject. And that is the real power of education, and where educators like ourselves can make a difference. We can equip our students with the skills they are going to need to solve the problems of the future. And while this in no way absolves us of our own responsibility to act, the least we can do is give those we educate examples of current sustainable practice in the areas they hope to move into. Because they're the ones who then go on to shape their industries into sustainable versions of what they are now. They're the ones who will develop the ideas which will end our reliance on old polluting technologies. They're the ones who will go further. Thank you.